There's a common belief throughout history that mankind was sculpted from the earth by a higher power. It is for this reason, perhaps, that we've always felt a kinship to the land we live on. From it we were birthed, and to it we will eventually return. Yes, Mother Earth is a vast and beautiful blue pearl, but her relationship with mankind has always been an odd one. Her benevolence brings us a bountiful harvest. Her anger brings us storms and earthquakes. But there's something about her disposition that brings a feeling of nostalgia and familiarity. Something about the earth is so very human. The most recent chapters of JoJolion have taught us quite a few new things about the rock humans, and what exactly it is that sets them apart from the prototypical human. Rock humans, by their very nature, are a largely independent and parasitic species. However, this isn't necessarily a trait written into their DNA. Rather, it is the natural outcome of their upbringing. From their very birth, rock humans are expected to fend for themselves by infiltrating an insect colony. They spend the entire duration of their formative years in the body of multiple generations of queens. In this way, they feed upon the nutrients that the colony provides for their queen. Their lives are founded upon the manipulation of other species, and as such, the world has taught them that they owe their existence to their parasitic identity. After all, it's the only way they know how to survive. On the surface, rock humans are visually identical to your bog-standard human. You can't tell who is a rock human simply by observing them. You need to figure it out by analyzing certain behaviors and biological processes. Some humans will form deep relationships together with rock humans, and yet still remain none the wiser. And yet, despite that, the rock humans aren't incapable of loving each other and humans. Despite their general incompatibility with human mates, the fact remains that they can fall in love and come to trust one another. It isn't impossible. One such example of this is Aisho Denenjiyama. Aisho is an extremely paranoid person, but he wasn't always this way. When he was younger, he fell in love with a human girl. This love was clearly genuine, as he trusted this person with a very important secret, the fact that he was a rock human. And that trust was rewarded with betrayal. Something similar happened to the rock human Dolomite. However, in his case, he wasn't actively betrayed. Rather, his own love for a human was what caused him to try to protect that human, leading to his own disfigurement. That being said, while he would prefer to not be disfigured, he doesn't seem to bear any ill will towards her, and even considers inviting her to the Blue Lagoon once again, his unattainable ideal for a perfect life. In both of these cases, the rock human involved was genuinely invested in their relationship with the human. As such, while 97.5% of human-rock-human relationships seem to end in breakup followed by murder, it would be naive to assume that this is solely the fault of either party, especially because that 2.5% of relationships still do work out. Those are the relationships where the trust held by both individuals is rewarded with faithfulness to their partner, where both are able to look past or even appreciate each other's differences. Now, the rock humans, since their debut, have acted as the primary opposing force to our protagonist Gappy, but he has much more in common with them than you might assume. Much like the rock humans, Gappy first enters into human society as a stark naked young adult. He has knowledge of things like math and measurements, but not of aging and common social behaviors. He even emerged from the earth, something you would expect the rock humans to do if you weren't aware of the classic hornet baby maneuver. However, the main difference between Gappy and the rock humans is their upbringing. They have a very similar base nature, but the rock humans were nurtured in an environment that rewarded parasitism and selfishness. The first thing that Gappy encounters after emerging from the earth is Yasuho, someone who kindly tries to help him. Then, soon after, he is adopted into the Higashikata family, and provided with everything he needs to live his life. These formative experiences built Gappy up as a much more selfless and human individual. The rock humans are just one half of a greater whole though. Much like our protagonist, JoJolion is a story with two sets that constantly come in contact, the Higashikata family and the rock humans. The two sides are meant to ideologically oppose each other at their very core. On the one hand, we have the Higashikatas, who are of course a family. They may bicker, but at the end of the day they all love each other, and the very thought of bringing their kin to harm is unbearable to them. On the other hand, we have the rock humans, a group of people who lead a mostly antisocial and independent existence. They typically only form groups as a means to an end, and tend to keep very few allegiances. Both of these groups are vital to the story of JoJolion, and as such, I don't see a scenario where either of them don't show up in JoJolion's finale in some way. The Higashikata's role in the finale seems to be set in stone on some level, concerning the focus that's been given to Jomen's desire to get his hands on the new Rokakaka in order to save Tsurugi and finally put an end to the rock disease. But with the rock humans, it's been much less clear. Toru has been a significant figure recently, but as much as people seem to think he's going to be a major player in the finale, I question how much longer his presence can last. Now, sure, he's a fairly recent addition to the story, having only been properly introduced midway through the Dr. Wu fight, but that's not really what I take issue with. As of right now, the Head Doctor arc has spanned about 15 chapters. We seem to have pretty thoroughly explored Wonder Review's abilities, and we have finally reached the big fight of Gappy and Rai against the Head Doctor, where the stakes have been set so that the first person to pursue the other will perish. Gappy has made it clear that his intent is to kill the Head Doctor, and that his only option is to do so right now during their face-off in the lab. We also know that his plan involves Yasuo on some level as well, which points to the solution involving taking down Toru. I just don't see a satisfying way this fight can conclude without either side's complete and utter defeat. And even if Toru does somehow get out of this intact, we've been dealing with Wonder Review for so long now that spending the remainder of the part with it in play would probably cause things to drag hard. It's a stand with a very dominating presence simply from being activated, which doesn't have a lot of room for interesting out-of-the-box thinking outside the misdirection that it employed from the beginning. Its usage is also so impersonal. We're only now having Gappy and Nkefu speak face-to-face because of the stalemate. As such, I think we're approaching the end of his prominence in the story. Wonder Review is, in his own words, the final point before returning home. This isn't the finale of JoJolion. Far from it. We haven't reached the flash forward that occurred 13 minutes before the harvest of the new Rokakaka at this point. Yet, even so, it feels like we're going to be approaching the climax without a single rock human adversary vying for the fruit. So, is that it? Are we really going to spend 75% of JoJolion's serialization building up the rock humans just to move along right as the climax of the story arrives? I just can't see that being the case. So, then who will be the major rock human player in the finale? At this point, it's probably too late in the story to start introducing new characters to act as villains. There are no remaining rock humans in the Demokon group or the Teaching University Hospital at this point. I doubt Dolomite cares about the Rokakaka after all the trouble he went through in his arc. Iwasuke is a dog. So how could Araki possibly involve the rock humans in the finale of JoJolion? Okay, so hear me out here. In chapter 99, the narration once again mentions on the very first page about rock human women being visually indistinguishable from humans. There's an odd thing to focus on, however, if you think about it. The following pages are centered around rock human babies, but that doesn't have anything to do with the appearances of their mothers. In addition, not only is this information that has been outright stated and shown prior, but also none of the rock humans Gappy has met over the entire duration of JoJolion have been female. Why would Araki not only reiterate this point, but also specify that it applies to female rock humans? It doesn't make sense unless it's something that he wants us to be reminded of for future reference. The line that follows is also somewhat out of place, but for a slightly different reason. It states that human males and rock human females are able to mate. This is an odd inclusion, considering we have no knowledge of any characters that have both human and rock human lineage, nor do we have any female rock humans for which this information is likely to be relevant in the future. It's even more odd when you consider how this information directly contradicts the research data shown earlier in the part, which claimed humans and rock humans are incompatible. That research was presented as coming from a fallible in-universe source, so it makes sense that it could be inaccurate, but then there's almost certainly a reason why it needed to be clarified. And there's absolutely no way the existence of cross-species humans is just an extraneous detail. Not when our protagonist is a fusion of two people, and definitely not when the story centers around a rock fruit taking on new properties after being grafted onto a different plant. It's far too narratively relevant. But for that to be the case, there would either still need to be a female rock human unaccounted for, or a human rock human crossbreed that we are not aware of. Presumably someone we already know, considering the line that precedes it. Let's take a second to go down the list and use the process of elimination to narrow down who in the female cast is most likely a rock human. We can cross Yasuo, Daya, Hado, and Kyo off the list right away since we've seen them all as children. Mitsubella laments her body changing as she has gradually gotten older, so we can cross her off. We've seen Holly just Akira unconscious, Yasuo and Josefumi's mothers have no reason to suddenly involve themselves in the story, and the remaining female cast of minor characters have so little presence that they might as well be a new character entirely. So that leaves only two characters left. The second most likely is Karera Sakanami, who you can make a surprisingly strong case for being a rock human. She's a selfish bum, we know very little about her family, and even her stand, Love Love Deluxe, has a very similar naming convention to the other rock humans. The rock human stands are all generally named after songs that focus on their unique type of isolation and one-sided relationships, which Sade's Love Deluxe album features quite a bit of. It wouldn't be impossible for Carrera to end up being a rock human, especially since she claims that she'll return at the end of her arc. But what throws me off with her is that I just can't see how someone with her characterization could possibly be the sole rock human in the finale. Yeah, sure, she claims she wants to get the Rokakaka for herself, but clearly not as fervently as the rest of the cast, and she spent several months on the run specifically because she was afraid of putting herself in a dangerous situation. As such, I think there's really only one character that fits pretty much every quality we're looking for in a rock human representative for JoJolion's finale, and I think you all know where I'm going with this at this point. Kato Higashikata, a character that I had once considered the most likely candidate for being the main villain, but had given up on after a continuous lack of new appearances. I once again put forward for consideration that Kato is the most likely candidate not only for being the main villain, but also the culmination of all the rock human buildup in JoJolion, and to do so, I feel it's imperative that we address all the most common points against Kato being a rock human, and clear up some misconceptions along the way. First is the idea that Kato can't be a rock human because the Higashikata children are not themselves rock humans. This idea came about because the concept of cross-species mating was mentioned right before rock human infancy was described, so people assumed that the result of a human male and a rock human female mating is somehow a pure-blooded rock human, but that doesn't make any sense. Bear in mind that the information we are given on rock humans in this chapter is told in the context of it being Toru's origin story. At this current point in time, we have no evidence that Toru is part human, and as such, no reason to conclude that this detail implies pure-blooded rock humans are the product of humans and rock humans mating. In fact, the idea is kind of absurd in the context of JoJolion. To reiterate, our protagonist is a fusion of two different people, and plant grafting is a central concept. Having people wrestle with their two conflicting halves is a major part of JoJolion's story, and as such, it would be really odd and contradictory to the ideas presented by the part for something like a human and rock human crossbreed to not exhibit both human and rock human characteristics in some way. And that's the thing, Kato's children do show signs of being part rock human, not just from their mother's side, but also from their father's side. After all, the Higashikata lineage has long been plagued by a hereditary disease that causes their body to turn to stone, just as a rock human's would. The similarity is even acknowledged in-universe by Narisuke in the I Am a Rock arc. The rock disease is frequently described as being a curse on the Higashikata bloodline, and we learned right from the beginning of the part through Yasuo's narration that a curse is an impurity handed down due to a sin committed by a distant ancestor. It's very likely that the rock disease is a direct result of a human having some level of rock human lineage. Most likely, an individual with both human and rock human ancestry goes through the initial stages of the development as a human normally would, but eventually their rock human biology catches up with them and causes their skin to petrify, just as a rock human skin typically does. The rock humans theologically being considered the fallback species explains why these crossbreeds would be primarily carbon-based as well. The second point I'd like to contest is that Kato can't be a rock human because rock humans are incapable of motherly affection for their child. This is just flat out wrong for a number of reasons. First off, we've already established in the cases of Aisho and Dolomite that rock humans are more than just monsters that cannot feel genuine love, even if they do have a natural predisposition to isolation because of their biology. Second, it's never outright stated that rock humans cannot feel affection for their children, rather that it's rare for them to feel affection for their children. This is most likely another product of their upbringing. It's natural for a rock human child to never meet their parents, so a rock human mother is actively disincentivized from forming any emotional attachment. This is further supported by the baby's size likely causing fewer signs of pregnancy, and the shorter term length giving less time to develop an emotional attachment before they get sent out to the forest. Now take all that into consideration, and then think of how a rock human having what is essentially just a regular human child would be different from having a rock human child. They'd carry the child for 9 months instead of 6, the baby would be larger, and therefore the pregnancy would be a more significant part of their everyday life. And even if we assume that a rock human mother wouldn't get the same sort of oxytocin release that comes from a typical human childbirth, there's also the mother forming a natural attachment to the child due to not having any reason to leave them in the forest. A human-rock-human hybrid is magnitudes more likely to have an emotional connection to their rock-human mother than a regular rock-human would. This very specific description of rock-human maternal instinct is something that I expect Araki has set up in advance so that Kato's intentions and feelings about her individual family members are never 100% opaque or 100% transparent, which is useful for engaging the reader's interest and making it less likely that we'll be able to predict how she'll act next. This is very similar to how we utilized Funny Valentine's patriotism and rhetoric back in Steel Ball Run. The third point is that Kato being a rock human would just be a twist for the sake of having a twist and doesn't actually do anything for the story. This is more of an opinion I've seen floating around than an actual argument against Kato being a rock human, but I figured I'd address it anyways because it ties into a couple of points I wish to make. The main thing that Kato being a rock human would accomplish within the story of JoJolion is finally tying both the Higashikata family plot and the rock human plot together in a way that feels natural and meaningful. Both sides of the story have interacted frequently in the past, but the Higashikata family really doesn't have any significant connection to the rock humans beyond simply competing with them for the new Rokakaka fruit and the vague connection of the rock disease. A member of their family being a rock human meaningfully invests them in the rock human plot and would allow the finale to satisfyingly wrap up pretty much every major plot point that's been introduced thus far in one fell swoop. It would also give Gappy more of a sense of belonging with the Higashikata family. In a sense, their circumstances of being half human, half rock human is identical to Gappy's own circumstances of being a fusion of two different people. This means that in the family's lowest point, Gappy could step up and be a leader for them, as someone who empathizes with feeling lost about your own identity and heritage, thus cementing him as a member of the Higashikata family. I would even go as far as to say that such a twist could recontextualize Kato's entire character in a really interesting way, as being someone both defined by and acting against the fate of their own species. Her connection to rock human infancy is one such example. A rock human begins its life by entering the colony of another species and acting as its queen. The colony then provides for the queen until the day that the rock human will eventually kill them all. The parallels to Kato's character here are clear. They reflect her marrying into the Higashikata family and becoming a queen for her own gain, and foreshadows that she will eventually betray them all to further her own interests. Hell, even Kato's hair resembles a hornet's nest. But it goes even further when you think about the fact that unlike a hornet colony, which is led by a sole queen, the Higashikata family is entirely composed of kings. This ties back to Kato stating that she refuses to be a woman whose life is decided by men. Kato is not the one in charge of the Higashikata family. Just as rock humans are the fallback for if carbon life were to die out, Kato is the fallback for if the Higashikatas were to have no successor. She's stuck between the rock human parasitism and the reality of her world. This is especially interesting when you compare Kato to JoJo's two other queens, the two killer queens. The Yoshikage Kira, the original universe, did something very similar to the rock human practice of taking over a colony by taking the identity of Kosaku Kawajiri. He assumed the role of the leader of the Kawajiri household in order to establish safety and security for just himself. The Yoshikage Kira of the new universe did something similar, but with one key difference. When JoJolion Kira assumed a new identity like Kato and the original Kira did, he really assumed a new identity, becoming a different person entirely. That identity was one of a prince, a person who will eventually become a king. This has set Gappy up to essentially be the antithesis to Kato. He himself is pretty much a rock human when it comes to his origins, but where he differs is he is willing to uphold the altruistic qualities of the Higashikata family and genuinely become one of its members rather than just use them for his own goals, while Kato's only concern is what taking over the family can do for her. Speaking of, it's been made clear at this point that what Kato wants is nothing less than to be the one in charge of the Higashikata family, along with their wealth and the Higashikata fruit parlor. But she specifically mentions the estate itself several times, which makes sense, as the ground of the estate includes the walleyes, which we've recently confirmed is a devil's palm. We also recently confirmed that rock humans have a fascination with special locations where the earth is blessed, with the ground of Morio being used as a specific example, the same ground that Kato expressed a fascination with. The final point I want to touch on is one that I feel is the strongest argument against Kato being a rock human, but even so still has two very likely explanations. Kato was imprisoned for 15 years, and during that time she worked a total of 3,662 days. That's pretty much every day she would have been legally allowed to work. According to Aisho, losing your focus for even a moment causes a rock human to begin hibernating. The rock human research page from the Love Love Deluxe arc adds to it by mentioning that sleep hits at different times depending on the individual. Their hibernation periods last between 30 to 90 days, and once they've woken, they will not sleep again for at least 2 months more. So how is it possible for Kato to be a rock human if she didn't hibernate a single time? One possibility is that Kato just never lost focus by spending all of her time either working or thinking about her family. Based on what we know about rock human biology, this seems to be a possibility, as there is no established upper limit for how long rock humans can keep the petrification at bay. The more likely explanation, however, is that Kato was smuggling in Rokakakas. We know from how Yotsuyu fed Owasuke the Rokakaka that it has the ability to release a rock creature from its hibernation state. So if Kato had some connection to the Rokakaka cartel, which she probably does considering Aisho's importation on Kira's ship was done through an order by the Higashikata fruit parlor, she would have been able to keep a gradual supply of Rokakaka coming her way, which would have allowed her to completely negate any hibernation she would have experienced. Okay, so based on everything we've established thus far, Kato could potentially be a rock human, but that doesn't necessarily mean she's the main villain on its own. Sure, that's the natural conclusion to be made with a twist like this, but that's not enough to go off of. Kato becoming more prominent in the final stretch of the story could just as easily end up being done in order to support Jobin's own role in the narrative, but there's a strong argument to be made with her being the main villain as well, independent of much of the rock human speculation. Let's start with the obvious. The fact that we still don't know her stand's name is perhaps the most blatant evidence that we still have much to learn about her character. But then there's also how Kato's name doesn't follow either of the main Higashikata naming schemes that even the members adopted into the family follow. The members of the family that were introduced as women are all named after the suits of playing cards, while the men all have a kanji pronounced Jo at the beginning of their name. Kato doesn't fit this mold though. Her name simply comes from the more all-encompassing word card, implying she's more of an overarching force in the family hierarchy. In addition, think back to the original universe villains. Once the concept of stands became introduced, they all began to follow a general theme with their abilities. That theme was time. Dio stopped time, Kira rewound time, Diavola skipped time, and Pucci sped up time. We're only in the second story of the new universe, so we can't say for certain that this idea of main villain abilities following a theme will continue, but we do know that D4C and Kato Stand do follow a shared theme, that being control of space. Both abilities allow things to travel between dimensions when enclosed between two surfaces. In D4C's case, this is used to travel to parallel universes, while in Kato's case it seems to be used to create pocket dimensions of some sort. That's not the only similarity Kato shares with Funny Valentine as well, because Funny Valentine was clearly based on the idea of a stage magician. His stand is shaped like a rabbit, his suit resembles a magician's long tailcoat suit. Dojan is essentially the Japanese equivalent of tada, and his ability is based on disappearing acts. Kato has an identical magician theme going on, with a different sort of style to it. We don't know what her stand looks like, nor whether she has any sort of catchphrase, but we do know she wears something akin to a tasseled stage performer's outfit, and that her ability is based on card tricks on some level. The two characters clearly have some level of intentional through line between their abilities and designs, which points to them sharing the role of a main villain in the narrative. But what about Jobin, you may be saying? Hasn't he been built up to be the main villain just as much as Kato? Well, yes actually, I agree. But consider for a moment how Jobin and Kato's characters are so inextricably linked together that much of Jobin's ideology has become his own extrapolation of Kato's ideology. If Kato is to be involved in any way with JoJolion's finale, then the two of them would practically end up joined at the hip and pursuing the same goal, to get their hands on the new Rokakaka. From this, it would seem that they'd be equals on some level, but let's not mince words here. Jobin may be an extremely threatening villain, but even his own son considers him to be a childish person. And Kato has been shown to guide his hand before. He simply looks up to Kato too much to not follow her will. This could have a lot of interesting consequences, as Jobin, despite frequently disagreeing with Narisuke on his methods, inherited many of Narisuke's ideals which would end up conflicting with Kato's ideals. Jobin would likely prioritize the Rokakaka being used to save Tsurugi, while Kato would prioritize the wealth and power the fruit could potentially bring the Higashikata family. As a result, Jobin would not simply take a backseat to Kato if she was the main villain. Rather, he would be more like the card at the top of a poker deck, the one that ultimately determines whether Kato's hand ends up being a royal flush or a bust. And that's where I think we'll be ending things off. If there's anything you think I failed to address here, then let me know in the comments. Thank you to Mono for providing the art of Kato you see here, and thank you to Medi for letting me implement many of the points in his own Kato video for this theory. Go check them both out, they make some really great stuff.